Hi friends, it's Shari. Today I'm creating a autumn themed knock knock who's there card. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do for my autumn themed card, so I pulled out my trusty scarecrow friend from Happy Harvest, and I also pulled out the new Pick of the Patch add-on pumpkins. And I am making a knock knock card today. This is actually the first knock knock card I have made, so I hope that everything goes well and we can learn together along the way. So I'm stamping out all of my images with lawnfawn jet black ink. I stamped out 2 of the trio of pumpkins from the Pick of the Patch add-on set, and I'm going to have 2 different looks for these trio of pumpkins. For this one, I'm adding that happy fall sentiment to that center pumpkin. This is what's going to come out of the little knock knock door. And then for the other ones, I want them to look like plain pumpkins, so I'm adding that little detail stamp that adds the extra ribs to that center pumpkin. So let's start by coloring Mr. Harvest here. Of course, he needs some blue jean overalls, although I do like to color these overalls in all kinds of fall colors. For this, I'm using B23 for my shadow and B21 for the rest of the color. Then I'm moving on to the hat, which I like to make a straw hat very often. So for this one, I'm using YR24 for the dark color on the sides, and then I'm pulling it towards the middle with a YR23. I'm using Y35 and coloring all of the straw. And then for the face, I'm using E02 up under the hat where the shadow would be, and then I will blend it out with a slightly lighter creamy shade. You can see I do like to test my markers sometimes, even though I have a color chart. Sometimes it's just easier to see those colors right next to each other. Now for his shirt, I looked at the pattern paper that I wanted to use and I found some greens that I felt matched pretty well. So I'm using G43 and G21 as my lighter color, and I'm just blending it out. It has a little bit of shading. I'm actually going to add some fun details to his shirt once I get him all colored. Then I'm going back in with that darker color and just adding a line along the bottom of his arms. For the band on the hat, I'm using R14. I will also pull in a darker red with the R05 and kind of do the sides so it looks like it's a rounded hat. And I'm also using that for his nose. I used a dark gray for the buttons on his overalls and then a brown for the post. Now I'm going to add some details, and I just have a dark brown fine tip pin that is sitting here on my desk. Nothing special about it, but it's just a dark brown color. You could also use black. I added some little freckles to his cheeks. I'm adding some little hash mark details to the hat. I think it makes it look much more like a straw hat. And then I added some stripe details to his shirt. And I just think that makes him come to life so much when you add those details. For the crows, I used an orange for their beaks, and then I like to use dark grays instead of black. I think that it makes the details of the crow not disappear quite as much. So I have that W7 as my shadow areas and just added the tiniest bit of that. And then I am blending out with that W5. So you get the look of that black bird, but you don't lose the detail of the wings and the eyes and all of the cute little details that we want to keep. So now we're ready to color the pumpkin patch, and the most fun thing about this is finding some fun colors for your pumpkins so that they all look different. So this one is more of a yellowy orange pumpkin with that Y38 and Y35. For the center pumpkin, I'm going to go a more traditional orange colors. So I'm using that YR07 as my shadow and the YR04 as my lighter color. I, of course, have the other set of pumpkins, so you can repeat some of those colors, which is what I'm doing here. I'm making sure that it's not that exact same pumpkin. I'm doing the one on the left instead of doing the one in the center. And actually, I pulled in those yellows that I used on the other trio and did the center with the sentiment with that yellow. And I'm using the yellow because it's a lighter color, and I think the sentiment stands out much better with that. Now, I don't know if you've seen the really fun kind of green teal pumpkins that are around nowadays, and that is what always inspires me to color this pumpkin here. Now, I wasn't getting a good blend with those Copics, those colors were too far apart, so I pulled out my BG 7.2 and 7.3 Olos, and I'm getting the colors I like a lot better. So I will use those again on that tiny little pumpkin you see on the other sheet of paper. I'm just going to go through and color all my stems. And then my leaves, I will color those all the same. So the YG03, and then I'm going to come back with a darker green and just do some little flicks of that darker green up from the base of the leaf. Now for this one over here, I did not want to make that one the teal color because I thought that would look too close to that other trio of pumpkins. So this one, I'm making a white pumpkin with that E00 and E000. Here's that BG 7.2 and 7.3 for that little pumpkin again. And I pulled out some darker oranges for this single pumpkin. I know that all the pumpkins on this page that I stamped here are going to be seen together when the card is closed, so I don't want any of them to match too much. So I blended that out. It is a little darker, but I thought I could make it even darker, so I'm pulling in that YR18 for some darker shading. Then I used the coordinating dies to cut them all apart and set them aside, and now I'm going to work on the knock-knock mechanism. So to make a knock-knock, you basically want to make a side folding card. Even though this is not actually going to be the card, this is just going to be the panel on the front, but you need that fold in the middle. So I'm making a landscape card today, so I made a long card. I cut it to 4 1/4 and I scored it in the middle. So we have a landscape oriented card that folds on the left side. I also cut my tree add-on for the knock knock out of that same kraft cardstock. And now I need to cut my door. So I'm using that rounded top door. You have a little arrow here on the side that lines up with the fold, and then a little arrow on the bottom, which is the bottom of the door. And in this case, since I'm using the tree, I'm going to line it up with the bottom of the card. So you can see I'm lining that up with the fold, lining it up with the bottom. You are going to cut this with this open like you see here. So I'm just going to get it in place and hold it there with a little bit of low tack tape. Then with this open, I'm running this through my die cut machine so I get that door cut on just that front panel. So you can see there when I close it up how that's going to work. And the tree will just layer right over it. Next, I want to cut the channel for my mechanism to run in. So let me open this back up. So we're looking at the back side. You want the arrow to point towards the door and the bottom of that little leg to line up with the bottom of the door. So in this case, again, it is lined up with the bottom of the cardstock as well. And I will just run that through the die cut machine and you can see it made 2 cuts. So when I close this, there's a channel hidden on the inside. The final piece that I need for my knock knock who's there mechanism is this T-shaped piece. So I'm going to cut that from the same kraft cardstock so that everything matches when the door is open. It has a little score line and you're going to fold in this little tab here. You're going to fold it away from you. Then you're going to take that T shape, so that little short end, and you're going to feed that through the slots at the top and the bottom so that this will move back and forth in those slots, just like that. So you want to make sure that this tab is kind of centered between the 2 slots. With the little tab I folded back open, it's going to line up with the fold of the door. And we're going to put the adhesive on that little tab. And for my adhesive today, I am using the 1/4 inch double-sided tape. So I know it is a nice and sturdy bond between the 2 pieces of cardstock. I'm going to actually use 2 little pieces of tape. So I'm putting one on here. I'm going to trim it off with my scissors and add another piece right here. Then with that tab facing up towards you and open like that, what we're going to do is line up the edge with the fold of the door. Make sure that T is centered between the 2 slots. I'm going to pull off the liner paper and then I'm going to close that little door right onto that tab and pick up that adhesive right there. And you can see how that is going to work and slide in there perfectly. Now, before I completely close this card and mechanism up, I actually want to do some work on the front because we're going to close this up with foam strips, and I want it nice and flat while I do the decorating on the front of my card. Now, the first thing I want to do for my scene is create a sky. So I have a piece of spiffy speckles paper here. This is cut to 4¼ tall by actually 4¼ wide. I did some measuring where that edge of that door was. Now, I probably could have cut it just slightly short. It did overhang my opening a little bit, but I'm trimming that out with my scissors. I don't need to worry about it going over the top of the door. That's going to be covered up by my tree and the leaves or the tree fluff that will go at the top. So you can see I could have cut that maybe 1/8 inch less and it would have been covered up by the tree as well. I am adding a little bit of ink blending to my craft cardstock of my tree with some dough ink just to give it some shading and some texture, and I love how it catches in the little stitching details of the tree as well. Now for the tree fluff at the top, I thought I would use some of the favorite flannel fall in that rainbow plaid. So I'm using the die for the tree and I'm just kind of lining it up and figuring about where I want it to be. But actually I switched it over. You can see I shifted it to the right because I wanted some of those oranges and reds in the tree. So I just kind of shifted it over. I'm going to trim this down. It's actually a little too tall right now. You're going to see I'll put it in here and it's in the way of my door. But I'm just going to trim off a little bit off the top and make it a little bit shorter. And now that fits there pretty perfectly. So I'll go ahead and glue that down to my background. And then I can add my tree and it will clean up where all those papers come together and just look really pretty. I can also add this piece to the door. Now there are little dies in the set where you can make something to hang on the door to say open me. I kind of left it plain because I just wanted it to be kind of a surprise that you had to find. Now for my grass or my ground, I'm using a piece of green from the Favorite Flannel Fall collection, and this was just a scrap. I cut the top with the wavy border and I'm just trimming it down to a strip. This is going to be my grass. It's going to be covered up a lot, so it doesn't really matter what you use as a top. You could just cut a strip of cardstock if you wanted. So I'm sticking that down. I tucked it under the tree, and then I can just trim off the excess. Now, before I add my images, I want to stamp some corn in the background, which I probably should have done before I put that green plaid paper down there, but I'm just going to kind of cover it up with this piece of paper, and I'm stamping with some fossilized amber distress oxide. So it is that oxide ink with a little bit of pigment. And I did not stamp this one very well, but I can line it back up and stamp it again. A lot of this is going to be covered up by my pumpkins and my scarecrow, but this just adds some more interest to the background. Now, I'm adding foam strips to the inside. I have this opened up. You want to make sure you add foam strips above the door and to the right, and you avoid that mechanism moving. So you can see that strip on the bottom, I stopped short of where those slots were created, and that way everything will move. I'm putting my little pumpkins that have the sentiment onto that strip in the door, and I wanted to keep this little mistake in there. I had it too far over. You cannot go past the fold of where that tab hits the door, and I'm just rubbing off my excess adhesive because I had it too far over. So I'm just scooting it over so that little swirl is going to line up perfectly. And now I have no problems with that popping out of the door. For all my images on the card, I'm adding some foam squares so it pops up off the background. So I started with my scarecrow. I added the other trio of pumpkins, and then I can take the 2 individual pumpkins and add them on the right side. And of course, we can't forget the cute little crows. This little guy always goes on the scarecrow's arm when I'm creating a card. Then I'm adding this one over here on the tree, flying around, and then this guy's going to be down here in the pumpkin patch. And I'm checking, making sure everything still works properly. I put all my adhesive in the right place. Now, right now, this is just a card front, so I need to add it to a card base. And again, you want to avoid that mechanism when you're adding adhesive to the back. So now we have it on a card base, so we have a place to write a sentiment inside. Everything's still working properly, and I can add my final touches of glitter to the tops of my pumpkins and the band on the scarecrow's hat. So here is a look at my finished card. I think it's super cute, even if it wasn't interactive, but you can open up that little door and you get that fun sentiment with that row of pumpkins inside, which I just think is so cute. So I hope this has inspired you to look through your stamps and find your favorite fall stamps, but also use the new Knock Knock Who's There to create a fun fall card. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.